I'm Karenna Gore. Welcome to everyone. We're really delighted that you're here, and each and every one of you. I want to say thank you to everyone who has spoken so far, to Julia, to Derek, former teacher at Union Theological Seminary, to Gregory Simpson, who is helping to organize and convene this in a way that we're also grateful for, to everyone at Union. And I can't think of a better way to begin than to be with Dr. Christian Braneon and Rabbi Jennie Rosen in an opening plenary conversation. I want to say at the outset, just to acknowledge that these past days have been frightening with the smoke from the wildfires, and I think the fact that this is such an effective wake-up call in a time that we are wanting effective wake-up calls does not make it any easier to experience or to process. And that is especially true, I'm sure, for those people that feel more vulnerable to this kind of situation, and to those young people who are not sure whether we are going to do what is necessary to stop this trajectory that we are clearly on. And I wanted to say a word about the word apocalypse, which was mentioned, because it is a word that has great meaning in religious scholarship, and as theologians point out, in the original Greek meaning, it is an uncovering or a revealing. And so I think we can see it in that spirit as we are here to uncover and reveal and illuminate our circumstances and come together to act on them. And so I am so honored by the presence of these two great leaders, and I'm going to introduce each of them and then have an opening question for each of them that I'm hoping they'll take their time with. It's meant to be a prompt for much of what you are offering, and then we'll have some follow-up questions and some audience questions at the end if we have time. So Dr. Christian Braneon co-leads the Environmental Justice and Climate Just Cities Network at Columbia University's Earth Institute and serves as the co-chair of the New York City Panel on Climate Change. He recently joined Carbon Direct as head of climate justice. He previously served as a climate scientist at NASA GISS and as co-director of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's inaugural Environmental Justice Academy for Community Leaders. His work on urban heat islands and environmental justice has been featured in many broadcast and print media outlets. In 2020, he co-authored America's Zero Carbon Action Plan, a comprehensive policy report by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that presents a strategic plan to create a carbon-neutral economy for the United States by 2050. He received an AXA Award for Climate Science in 2021 for his contributions to the understanding of climate change and related adaptation strategies. And that's only part of what I know are your many accomplishments. Rabbi Jennie Rosen is the founder and CEO of Dayenu, an organization mobilizing the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. She has spent over 2 decades advocating for social change and creating dynamic new initiatives at the heart of the Jewish social justice movement through her leadership at HIAS, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, and Columbia University Hillel. Ordained by HUCJIR, where she was a Wexner Graduate Fellow, Rabbi Rosen has twice been named one of the Forward's 50 Jews in America. And so to begin with Dr. Braneon, we do want to begin with the science. We know how closely and with such expertise and for how long there have been scientists who have been giving information, communicating information to the world. And you are a climate scientist and an engineer, and we would love to hear from you if you could tell us a little bit about how you all study this and what we can expect from climate change in New York City.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you all for taking time to advance climate justice together. You know, I often will tell people, Karenna, we've had the science to understand climate change for a long time. Actually, Elizabeth Foote in the late late 19th century actually presented the science around climate change. And I should actually say she was not able to present the science. Actually, I think a man had to read the abstract of her work at the conference. But we knew that at that time in the late 19th century. And then in the 1950s, Russian scientists were pretty convinced that human beings were causing global warming. By the 60s in the United States, I think we had this understanding. And then when I was growing up, you had Captain Planet cartoons, and you had all this media coming out to educate the public around climate change. So sometimes we think there has been some debate, but really there's just been a lot of misinformation that's been put out there. But we've had the science for some time now. Global climate models have evolved since the 60s as we've had a better understanding of climate change. And these are really just complex mathematical models that climate scientists use to understand climate change. What we do is we take all kinds of measurements on the ground, measurements from satellites, measurements in the ocean, and we try to do the best we can to mathematically model the historic climate conditions, but also the future climate, okay? But these models are not perfect. There's some challenges with these models, and yet we do have a lot of confidence about how global warming will proceed, like moving forward. So I would say to you, we have pretty good understanding of what New York City will look like in terms of extreme heat. If you think about what would typically be the number of days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, like that's a pretty hot day, like a day you can probably relate to. By the 2080s, we'd expect there'll be about 3 to 4 times as many days like that in a year. If you think about heat waves, days where it's really hot for maybe a few days straight, these heat waves are something we should really pay close attention to because people die during heat waves. And I think our guest from the city pointed out that in New York City, black and brown folks are more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to die during heat waves. This isn't chance, right, that black and brown folks are more likely to die during heat waves. And so this is something that's particular interest for me. But in terms of heat waves, we expect 3 to 4 times as many heat waves by the 2080s also, right? And even though we have air conditioning, even though we have cooling centers and other strategies for addressing extreme heat, there's always going to be folks that can't afford air conditioning, right? I mean, I grew up in Houston, Texas. We never turned on the air conditioner, like not once in hot and humid Houston, Texas. We just could not even conceive of paying an electric bill that would be higher because of using air conditioning. And I was fine, and I was, of course, young and able to cope with that. But lots of folks, when there's a power outage following a heat wave, may be in serious trouble. Like, they may die, right? You often will find folks over 65 that have been deceased in their apartment, in their home for days, for weeks, maybe because they're disconnected from family members, maybe because no neighbors have been in contact with them. And so this is a huge concern. There's going to be places in the world beyond New York that may be unlivable later in the century. You may not be able to stand outside for 30 minutes without being in big trouble. In New York, we also need to be concerned with extreme rainfall events. We're expecting maybe even the same amount of rainfall to fall during the year. But imagine, instead of it coming in the pattern we usually expect, it just all comes at once, or all comes just a few times during the year. And we typically would call these cloudbursts, these big rainfall events. Think about Hurricane Ida, for example, as a recent example of this. So even if there's not more rainfall during the year, we expect these really big rainfall events. We also expect more droughts, more extended periods where you don't have enough rainfall. Last summer, for example, was particularly dry. And the last thing I would want to share is that we know that the sea levels are rising, right? We're already seeing sea level rise. This is one of those climate phenomena that we don't have absolute certainty around. We know the sea levels are rising. We know they're going to continue to rise for centuries, but the timing is unclear. The timing is really unclear. When will the sea level rise happen? Right now, we expect about at least 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise by the 2080s here in New York City. 2 to 3 feet sounds like a lot. And I would say it is significant and it is a lot. But what's more concerning about it is that the same storms we've had in the past, like Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Ida, and I can show you a clip actually here of Hurricane Isaias that came in 2020, that made landfall in August of 2020. These storms that may cause power outages, these storms that may strand people, destroy people's cars, damage their homes. Storms like this will be so much worse with 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise. So I think what we have to hold in our minds, it's not just that the sea levels will be higher, it's that the same storms that were so destructive in the past will be more destructive in the future due to sea level rise. So the three types of climate risks I would really want you to be aware of are around extreme heat and heat waves, around cloud bursts and extreme rainfall, and around sea level rise and coastal flooding.
Thanks. First of all, it's just wonderful to be here, and I want to just lift up you, Karenna, and your whole team for such an important gathering. And it could not be on a more auspicious week. I've lived in New York for 36 years, and we've been through a lot, and nothing like this last week. There's a verse in Psalms, Kol haneshama tahallel, all of breath praises God, and breath has been, through the pandemic and now through this past week, so much on our minds and hearts. I am a rabbi who became a rabbi in order to mobilize the Jewish community together with other faith communities to address issues of social, economic, and racial justice. And for me, that was always more people-oriented, if you will, refugees, hunger, poverty. And I really had my own awakening a number of years ago to the climate crisis through reading IPCC reports, through the media finally covering it in a different way, through my own experience with refugees, working at HIAS with refugees all over the world, imagining what 1 billion refugees could be, which is one of the numbers that is predicted if we don't make serious change, and through my own experience of some weather events. I think everybody has their own aha moment. Some people, it's been since childhood. Some people, like me, it's always been sort of background concern, and then there was a moment of aha, which was also a where the hell have I been? People have been talking about this for decades, for actually centuries. And I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you could sort of note the moment that you, or the year, or the period of your life where you sort of woke up, if you will, to the climate crisis? Yeah. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And most people also feel like, so what do I do? I know that composting or putting up solar panels is important, but not sufficient. And so I was also waking up to the fact that the climate crisis is, as you spoke about, and has been in all of the background readings, I think lifted up so importantly, a racial, social, and economic justice issue. This is about who is least contributing and most impacted, first and worst. And at the same time, it affects all of us, right? I think about it a little bit like the early days of COVID, where everyone was susceptible, but it did not impact all communities equally. And I was also having conversations about how the Jewish community was not fully showing up in all our people in power. And there was a real gap. So I started Dayenu. We actually are based, we're a national organization, but we're based in the Interchurch Center at Auburn, right around the corner. and founded Dayenu to mobilize the Jewish community to really join with the broader faith and secular climate movement to do everything we can to address the systemic issues underlying the climate crisis. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk some about that. And also to build a spiritually rooted Jewish climate movement. Because this is not only a political, ecological, justice issue, it's also an issue of the soul. It's also what it means to confront this time that we're living in. And we talk about mitigation and adaptation, right? Those are kind of the two big frameworks for climate. I believe we also need to be spiritually adapting to this moment. That this is, as religious communities, a real time for us to be holding people through this great adaptation, through this great turning, and also mobilizing people. And this really turns to, I think, what is the role, you asked, Karenna, of faith communities and religious communities. So Dayenu is building a multi-generational movement. I think we know that this affects all generations, not all generations equally. You can think about some of the generational differences, not to overly generalize. I think younger people, for whom this is all they've known, are really angry. I think older generations have a lot of guilt and sadness. I think my generation, Gen X, the world's not as we thought it was. We sort of grew up with this model that you keep working and things keep getting better and better. And that's not, so there's a loss around also just our understanding of the reality of the world. So just a few generalizations or snapshots. But faith communities are also multi-generational communities. And what we need is a multi-generational response. And we need, as one of my colleagues says, she had been working in Sunrise, and then she came to Dayenu, and she said, we all need to go get our people. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment. So Dayenu is seeking to go get the Jewish community, but to do so very much in partnership, and we work very closely with other faith communities, with frontline communities, with national, sort of the big greens, as well as the EJ, the environmental justice groups. We need all of these groups and pieces. Most people are concerned, and they're not really sure what to do. And so Dayenu seeks, as many climate mobilization organizations do, to identify campaigns and ways for people to come together to address on a systemic level the underlying causes of the sorts of things that the results of which you were speaking of. I think that faith communities, I think about as having sort of five roles, if you will, or 5 things that make faith and religious communities particularly powerful avenues for change and for holding us through this time. One is the prophetic voice. There are some real villains here. You alluded to the fact that there was information, that has been propagated. You didn't necessarily mention by whom, but I think we all know that the fossil fuel industry has been working assiduously for decades to obfuscate. We know that there are politicians who are doing the bidding of fossil fuel companies as we speak. And I think that faith communities have a real role as a prophetic voice. And what is the future going to look like? Who are we going to center in that? What does it mean to have an orientation to the common good? What does it mean to identify who is most vulnerable and most impacted? And I think that faith communities and faith leaders, there's a prophetic role that is critically important. There is some real truth out there that can or cannot be called out. And I think sometimes there's a reluctance, honestly, and I know we face this in our own community, to name, for lack of a better word, the bad guys, and therefore not to mobilize around that as much. The second is, I think that our religious values and stories and tradition have so much to teach us, and again, to call us to action and to sustain us in that action. Dayenu thinks a lot about what can we do that's going to have real impact right now, because we are in a time of great urgency. They tell us we have 7 years left to really shift things before we're going to be entering a whole other level of impact. And we also need to be building a movement for the long haul, because we have generations ahead of us, and the question is, what will their lives be like? And how will we build communities and movements to sustain this future that we're building? And, you know, in Jewish tradition, there are the values not only of Shomrei Adamah, protecting the earth, or Bal Tashchit, not wasting, but also values around justice. Tirdof Tzedek, pursue justice. Shomer Alma Yatom Va'almanah, protecting the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. I think that how we draw from those traditions is critical to how we actually shape our future. Because we are going through, God willing, a tremendous transformation of our society. Moving from, you know, based on fossil fuels to a just green economy, and that's gonna come with tremendous change. And I think that our tradition has a lot to teach us about how to be called courageously to action and how to live through periods of transformational change. The third is spiritual resourcing. And this is what I was speaking to about spiritual adaptation. How do we make space for people to confront the grief and the anger and the loss, and to cultivate active hope? That younger generation is also, as I'm sure you, for those of you who have young people in your lives, kind of on the verge of a lot of nihilism as well. Like, when you think about the context in which they've come of age, how could they not? So spiritually resourcing, and that includes music and art and what we call climate Torah, or in your own tradition. What is the climate Torah of your tradition that can spiritually resource folks? The fourth is community. First of all, the faith communities, and it was mentioned in terms of the mayor's office, like, we are incredibly networked. When you think about this city, one of the networks that underlies the whole city are communities of faith. So how do we utilize those networks for change and for support? We think about this past week. Who were the communities checking in on each other, making sure that everyone had air they could breathe to sustain them? So the mutual support and the networks and the communities that we're going to need only more so in these coming years. And finally, I think faith communities can play what I think of as like an inside-outside game. Safed, my colleague, Imam Safed Kotovic, and I have sort of a snapshot that I'll just end with that I think of. So in 2021, the fall of 2021, Safed and I were arrested outside the White House as part of the People versus Fossil Fuel protest, protesting the White House continued support for the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And there's some kind of humorous photos of the two of us linking arms, you know, being arrested. Fast forward, fall of 2022, last fall, Safed and I were invited by the White House to attend the celebration of the Inflation Reduction Act. So, and why? Because our communities were part of many communities that worked for years to bring about the most transformational piece of legislation in American history around climate, the Inflation Reduction Act. It is not perfect. There are many things about it that are problematic. And it is $370 billion, which actually, because of the way the tax rebates work, is actually an infinite amount of money that communities need to be accessing, just quick plug there, to bring about a just, clean energy economy, and including Justice 40. So I share that snapshot because I think that that is the power of faith communities, to be both protesting and also on the inside leading our country.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Dr. Braneon, what are some of the most frequently asked questions about climate science?
Yeah, that's great. Is it climate change real? Is a common question I get. I think one question I'm getting a lot right now is around what should we do about sea level rise in New York City, and it's a very complicated problem because we're not used to planning 80 years out, or 100 years out, or 150 years out. So for me to tell New Yorkers, you should make sacrifices today for people that want to live in New York 150 years from now, because of sea level rise projections that have uncertainty associated with them, is very difficult. I think the city of New York struggles with that. And yet, we can actually still take actions today. And so what I usually tell people about what we should do about sea level rise, as I say, is what we should do, because we know the sea level rise is coming. We should create affordable housing that's at higher elevations now, before the real estate industry catches up and fully understands and fully appreciates the coastal flood risk on the waterfront. Go ahead and set up that affordable housing. Go ahead and set up places where there's public housing before the real estate industry catches up and snatches up all that land and all that property. That's what I often say about the sea level rise question. People also ask me, what are effective ways to deal with extreme heat? How can we address extreme heat? They'll ask me, should we do geoengineering as well? No, we should not do geoengineering. Very, very quick answer. I think we should not be playing God, so to speak, and we don't have a perfect understanding of that science. I have a colleague, Kate Marvel at NASA, who has a great piece in the book, All We Can Save, about this. All We Can Save is really an anthology of essays from bold women addressing the climate crisis. So one, I would say the way for us to address extreme heat is not geoengineering. It's really not even the solution to me is partially revolves around climate science, and that it involves us reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, stopping the use of plastic, or reducing our use of plastic. But a lot of it is really leaning into social resiliency, leaning into neighbors checking on their neighbors, leaders like you checking in on your congregations, anticipating that there's going to be heat wave, seeing that heat warning, and you proactively thinking about who in your lives, who in your networks, who in your communities may be at risk, right? So I think a lot of the things we do to address extreme heat and other climate risks will actually just be humans reaching out and looking out for other humans. Lastly, I'll say one of the questions I get from engineers and architects and from planners and from the city is how will extreme rainfall events change? Like, how much more often will we have Hurricane Ida type events? How much more often will we have cloudbursts? And the unfortunate thing I will say to you is, this is very similar to when you see a weather forecast that says it's going to rain tomorrow, and you pack your umbrella and you've got your boots on, and it's like a sunny day the next day. We really are not able to model clouds very well. Clouds are very small in comparison to the scale we use with global climate models. And so it's very difficult for us to project in the future what extreme rainfall will look like. And so I'm not able to answer that question often for architects and engineers and say to them definitively, hey, we know what extreme rainfall is going to look like. We know what that's going to look like in the future, but we exactly what it's going to look like. But we know there's going to be more extreme rainfall events. There's going to be more, kind of torrential style rain events. So we need to be prepared. We need to make climate adaptation decisions, changes to our built environment, how we design roads and buildings, and configure how they're connected, that allow us to not be locked into bad decisions that make it more difficult for us to adapt to climate change in the future. So I would say those are kind of the three questions that I often get, and but I'm open to other questions that you all might pose.
I'm sure we'll have some. Thank you so much. And Rabbi Rosen, feel free to respond to anything that he said as well. But my next question to you is, how do biblical texts and stories and theology inform your work about the climate crisis?
So I referred earlier to climate Torah, and by Torah I don't mean Torah with a capital T, Torah with a lowercase t. And I say that because I would really invite everyone to think for yourself as you sort of go through today, what is your climate Torah? What are the traditions or the texts or the teachings that really inform your engagement with climate and that you think would resonate for your people. Because in my experience, it's not necessarily the we are stewards of the earth, of course, but I have never seen somebody like read that or hear that and then sort of be led to mobilization or even be led to comfort. I think one of the ways that I've been trying to expand what we think of as climate Torah is what are the teachings of resilience? What are the teachings of courage and courageous action in the face of calamity? To sort of zoom out a little bit, if you will, to understand climate. Yes, of course it is about the earth and our relationship to the earth and earth ethics. And living in this moment in the face of the climate crisis is also about the stories that inform us about our own agency and how we cultivate courage. So one of the stories that I think a lot about is when the Israelites were wandering in the desert, God, they're in the midbar, in the wilderness for 40 years, and God says, the teachings are not far away from you. It's not too baffling for you or beyond your reach. It is not in the heavens or beyond the sea. No, it is very close to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart to do it. Lo b'shamayim hi. It is not in heaven. The future of the world is in our hands. It's in our hands like it's up to us, but it's also in our hands like we have the resources. We have what we need. We have the science. We have the technology. We need more of the political power. But we have what we need to close the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And we named, I'll just sort of give one other frame that we often think about, which is the name Dayenu comes from a song we sing at the Passover Seder, right? The story of liberation from slavery to freedom, the Exodus. And we sing this song, Dayenu. It's a very joyous song that's like, if God had given us the Torah, but not brought us to the land of Israel, if God had created the world, but Dayenu, it would have been enough. But Dayenu also means we've had enough. Enough climate devastation, enough valuing fossil fuel over humanity, enough. But there's a double entendre, because Dayenu also means we have enough. And I think it is so important for us to remember that we actually have enough. We have what we need to transform the world so that everyone can have enough.
Thank you. Dr. Braneon, I know you've done a lot of work with community engagement, with environmental justice, and you also have this expertise with data and science, and I'm wondering how those go together, and specifically, what data sets do you use to understand climate risk, and how do you engage everyday people in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I use quite a bit of NASA data sets, NASA data, and a lot of it is satellite data. Satellites are orbiting the Earth all the time, and the satellites are really giving you a snapshot of what's happening on the ground, happening on Earth. And what I really like to do is use the satellites in cities to figure out what parts of the city are hotter than other parts of the city. This phenomenon is called the urban heat island effect, like where you have concentrations of concrete and roads and asphalt and pavement. It's going to tend to be warmer than the rural areas outside of the city. And so what I've done is typically use satellite data from NASA to map the hottest parts of the city. But recently with leaders from South Bronx Unite, which is an environmental justice organization in the South Bronx, we've actually gotten community members to come out in the field and collect really critical data on the ground, because the satellites are way up in the sky, and they give you a sense for maybe roughly 100-foot by 100-foot areas, like how hot they are. But we went out in the field with community members, and they're actually having sensors attached to their bikes, having sensors attached to cars as they drive routes through the South Bronx. We were able actually to align that satellite data with what's happening on the ground. We did that project in partnership with a government agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And it was really powerful to engage community members, to get them really just like a firsthand understanding of extreme heat. We went out on a very hot, a relatively hot day in the summer of 2021. And we actually worked with Columbia University to collect data near Columbia University, near this more affluent part of New York City, and also collect data in the South Bronx. And we designed the study deliberately that way, expecting to see a difference in extreme heat in this area versus the South Bronx, and that's exactly what we found, was that in some parts of the South Bronx, when you compare to this part of Manhattan, maybe the difference is 8 degrees Fahrenheit at the same time of day, right? And what was amazing is after that, we actually overlaid redlining boundary information, so maps of where parts of New York City had been redlined. So if you're not familiar with redlining, this was this practice where some folks actually received mortgages that were subsidized by the US government that allowed them to buy homes as early as the 1930s, right? And those folks tended to overwhelmingly be folks identified as white. And what's fascinating is when you look at the documentation around how they decided who got these federally backed loans, there's handwritten sometimes notes like, don't invest in this community because there's Jewish folks. Don't invest because there's black folks or Asian folks in this community. So it was very explicit. It wasn't just the quality of the infrastructure, the quality of the home, but it was very explicit, like, don't invest in this neighborhood because of who lives in this neighborhood, what they look like, what religion they practice, right? So it's not chance that in New York and in other cities across the US that some communities are much hotter than other communities. This is because of disinvestment. And I'm really excited and proud to be able to work side by side with community members, really in a non-hierarchical way. We really partnered with the South Bronx Unite. This is often a challenge for academics who kind of have a paternalistic approach, right, to work with communities. I know, and let me educate you on what's going on in your community. Let me help you understand. But people understand racism, right? We didn't need this. We didn't need the data actually to know this. But we knew that that doing the study would help other folks who are not as familiar with racism understand how racism manifests itself, right? And what's interesting about it, as I do this work, kind of showing racial inequity and how it intersects with climate risks, you realize that some folks have never had a conversation with their parents about racism, right, their entire life. They've never talked to their kids about racism, certainly not in the context of anti-black racism, right? So how can they begin to even grapple with it? Scholars will say if you've never talked about it, you actually probably don't have complex ideas about racism. You have maybe really simple, kind of surface level construction of racism. But what I'm really excited about with my work with NASA data and with community collected data is that there's this opportunity to create a more equitable society as we address the climate crisis, right? And what I often will say to my colleagues, and some of them are here, is, what would it look like for us to put just as much effort into creating racial equity as we put into constructing racial hierarchy and maintaining racial hierarchy, right? So that's what I would ask you guys to think about. What would it look like to put just as much effort into creating racial equity as we put into constructing racial hierarchy? Think about Jim Crow, black codes, terrorism, domestic terrorism, war on drugs. Think about all these efforts we put into it. Let's think about what it would take to create a more racially just society as we address the climate crisis.
Thank you. So, Rabbi Rosen, I would invite you to comment on that from your point of view as well, what Dr. Braneon just said.
I think that you knit together the climate crisis and the way in which it is both informed by and perpetuates in many ways racism, and is an opportunity for us to build a different kind of future. And the work that you're doing, and I love it's such a treat to be on a panel where there's sort of the science, the sociology, the faith. It's like such a non-siloing that I think is actually where the creative future is going to come from. Because as you said, if we actually construct this new future to be as a central goal to dismantle racism and to build a more just future, we're in a moment of crisis. And so how we respond to this will either further embed racism into our society, or it's a point of a break, but it's going to take incredible intentionality, and I think that's what you're calling on all of us to really think about. And that is from the most micro, that is from the asphalt and the pavement in a given neighborhood, to the most macro in terms of how resources are used. And I think, not to keep coming back to the Inflation Reduction Act, but I think how that gets employed and deployed is the moment we're in now, and we can do that in a way that centers communities that have been historically marginalized. We can do that in a way that has an intentional effort to dismantle racism, or we can do that in a way that perpetuates the incredible disparities. And I think one of the things that's very powerful about being here this week in this panel is that it's New York City focused. And I think we have in New York City, I mean, obviously it's a unique and it's a microcosm in certain ways of all of the issues that are across, our nation. And so I think we're in a critical moment now, and I do think that faith communities have a role to play, again, both in the prophetic, in the actual implementation, in the mobilization. Are we mobilizing our people to ensure that how those resources are used are just and equitable, and actually working to undo some of the sort of trauma and racism that is built into so many of our systems here in the city. So I can only say yes, yes, and yes, and that this is a moment. Like, we're really in both scientifically we're in a critical moment, and politically we're in an incredible moment. There is enormous potential right now, and we can either lean into that and we can direct it in ways that are going to create a different future, or we can sort of sit back and let things unfold as business as usual. And we're not in a time where business as usual is actually a viable option for the future of humanity.
Thank you so much. That reminds me of my colleague, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, who's going to be leading a breakout group later, founded an organization called Kairos, where that concept of time is not just chronological, but a particular quality of time that only happens every so often, that Kairos time. And I have so many more questions I'd love to ask both of you all, but I also want to give participants a chance to ask questions. But before I do that, I wanted to just give both of you a chance to say anything else that's on your minds that you haven't had a chance to say and want to be sure to relay.
I would just stress, as someone who has family, my father's side of my family's from New Orleans, and when I started graduate school, it was in 2005, and Hurricane Katrina struck just as I was starting graduate school, and really shaped how I approached my whole PhD program. I wasn't sure what I was going to do in grad school. I just was like, I'm not ready to work. They're going to give me this money to go to school. I'll do it. And once that struck, I started thinking more about, what was the impact I can make and how I could align my values with my work and my career. And when, we talk a lot about, you guys are all familiar, I'm pretty sure, with Hurricane Katrina. But just as a personal note, one of my uncles who was there in New Orleans when it struck was shell-shocked after it happened. He never really spoke the same way anymore. He just almost kind of retreated inside his body. It was such a dramatic event for him that he never really recovered, and he passed away really well before his time, before my grandfather even passed away afterwards. So as you think about your congregations, as you think about even yourself, as you experience these climate risks and these extreme weather events, think about the psychological toll that these events are taking, and the role you have in uplifting and supporting your congregations and your families and your neighbors is absolutely critical. And so some things will not be physical. You know, it won't always be a physical impact. It always won't be someone being physically sick. But this is really taking a toll on folks, whether it's a flood event, whether it's extreme heat event, whether it's something like this with the wildfire smoke. Be conscious that it's not always going to be a physical impact, that some of this is happening in ways that you may not see.
I want to go back to the mitigation and adaptation, which is like such wonky wonky language, and I think is incredibly important framework for communities of faith and religious communities to also think about, because our work is both to mitigate, to do everything we can in this moment to mobilize our communities to take action. And I want to I can't let this panel go by without just mentioning New York Renews as a really powerful, I think Jeff Levy-Lyons is here from New York Renews, incredible 300 plus organizational coalition, a lot of congregations, a lot of community groups working on New York state policy. New York is a leader nationally. What happens in New York matters not only for New York, but it matters for the whole country. And I can't kind of state that enough. The importance of our communities being part of a community effort to avert the worst of climate disaster. And that's the mitigation piece, and we're all parts of religious communities that can and must be part of mobilizing that power. That's what our call is, to be living in this time and to be leading in this time. And there's the adaptation piece, which you spoke so poignantly about with your uncle's, the way that it landed for him, and for every single person of whatever generation, whatever race, whatever background, is grappling, whether consciously, is it a wake you up in the night, or is it just like a hum in the background? Depends on who you are. But every human being living in this time at this point has some consciousness of this. And so how do we as communities of faith resource people, support people, hold people in this time, and give space for the grappling with that, and the cultivation, of what Rebecca Solnit calls, hope as a verb, cultivating a sense of active hope and courageous leadership. And that, I think, is a role for all of us who lead and live in communities of faith.
Such a great note to end on. Can you join me in thanking Rabbi Rosen and Dr. Braneon?